After our interview, James Galbraith and I talked about how his famous father, as liberal a Democrat as I've ever met, became very close friends with the icon of the modern conservative movement, the late William F. Buckley, Jr. They had debated each other on Buckley's influential talk show, Firing Line, which ran on public television stations for 28 years. As he left, I promised James my copy of this new book, Right Time, Right Place, Coming of Age with William F. Buckley, Jr. and the Conservative Movement by Richard Brookhiser. When Richard Brookhiser was a teenager in upstate New York, he and his family were fans of Buckley's show. And in 1969, unhappy at the protest his classmates were mounting against Richard Nixon and the war in Vietnam, the young Brookhiser decided to protest the protests. He wrote an article and sent it off to the National Review, that influential conservative magazine founded and edited by Buckley, whom Brookhiser knew only from television. You can imagine his surprise and delight when several months later the article showed up on National Review's cover, a day after Brookhiser's 15th birthday. That precocious beginning launched Richard Brookhiser on a prolific career, first at Buckley's side and then as the author of several acclaimed books on our founding fathers, including George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. He was last here on the Journal discussing the life and legacy of Thomas Paine. Richard Brookhiser, welcome back to the Journal.
Thanks for having me.
What was the right time and the right place?
Well, for me, it was 1969 and shortly thereafter, and it was the excitement of discovering the conservative movement, which my family did through Firing Line.
Is that right?
That was the first time we were aware of Bill Buckley, was the TV show. Then my father bought one of his books, his third book, Up From Liberalism, and then we subscribed to the magazine. So that was how we got in the slipstream. And then as you said, I had the good fortune to send him a piece which he decided to publish. So, you know, here was the thrill of being a kid who loved to write, and here's this guy who's a great writer, and he says, I like your stuff, I'm going to publish it. It was just like getting a charge directly from the master.
You are not the only one who has said of that period that it was a pivotal moment in our political and intellectual history. What made it so?
A post-Depression, post-war liberal consensus was finally coming apart, was beginning to come apart. World War II had been won, obviously, by an exertion of the government, and the Depression seemed to have been ended by the exertions of the government. And there was a consensus that this was the way that we should address all our future problems, and that we could do it successfully by bringing, you know, the best thoughts and then the powers of the state to bear upon them. But in the late 60s, for a lot of reasons, the war in Vietnam, racial troubles that the civil rights bills didn't seem to be able to address, people all across the spectrum began having doubts, and many of them were on the right. And that was really the moment that conservative criticisms of this consensus began to get traction.
You begin the book with a flat assertion, William F. Buckley changed the world. How so?
I think he did, because he changed a climate of opinion in America. He made conservative ideas respectable. And the way he did that was by making sure he presented them at the highest level, you know, whether he was doing it himself or whether his magazine was doing it. And he also did it very aggressively, especially if he felt he was being shown disrespect. And that was something...
Give me an example. What do you mean?
Well, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great historian.
Liberal.
And a liberal man all his life. And he and Bill were tussling about something or other, and Schlesinger wrote him a letter, and in passing he said, National Review or the National Enquirer or whatever you call your magazine. Well, Bill was just not going to let that pass, so when he wrote back he said, now, Arthur, suppose I began a letter, Dear Arthur, or Dear Barfer, or whatever you call yourself. And that's just to call a Pulitzer Prize winner to order and say, look, we can have a debate, but if you want to, like, call names, I'll do that too. I'll do it as well as you.
I always thought that the man who defined his mission as standing athwart history, yelling stop, was something of a utopian, was he? Because history can't be stopped. History, that's not nature's to give.
Of course that's right. Now, Bill, you know, Bill had contradictory impulses, as do we all. He also often quoted a line of Whittaker Chambers, whom he admired maybe more than anyone else. And Chambers said, "To live is to maneuver."
Yeah.
And Bill always, he quoted that line many, many times. And you know, certain battles are lost, and they're lost forever, but you don't just then go home and say, oh, you know, the heck with it, the heck with the world. You have to be out there doing the most you can, and then also, surprisingly, sometimes battles you wrote off, it turns out you can win them. For instance, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Who would have thought? National Review actually did run a cover with a picture of Lenin and the glass being smashed right at the beginning of that year. But that was, you know, that was a kind of almost a whimsical cover of ours. And yet then in 1989 the Berlin Wall falls. So sometimes those old battles do end in victory.
But he couldn't stop history, but if he could have, he would have stopped the civil rights movement, right? I mean, I still have some of his columns where he not only defended segregation, 1959, but he defended white supremacy. He said, the white community is entitled to prevail politically because for the time being anyway, the leaders of American civilization are white.
That's what he thought in the late 50s. He came to see that that was wrong, and he said that he had been wrong. Now, to his credit, he was not saying that for reasons of innate racial superiority or that blacks were innately racially inferior, which many Southerners were saying. That was sort of a cultural argument. I think it was, nonetheless, it was wrong, and it was wrong for him to have made it. But, you know, so that's an early position that he had and that he abandoned as the 60s went on.
I was struck in the late 90s when Buckley called for decriminalizing marijuana. I mean, he published an edition of his magazine announcing the war on drugs is lost. What led him to that conclusion? Because that was not in line with the conservative philosophy of the day.
Well, he had been thinking about the drug problem seriously since the mid-60s. I mean, as early as 1965 when he ran for mayor of New York. And he had a...
When he said, if he was asked if what would happen if he won, he said, I'd demand a recount.
He also said he'd put nets outside the windows of the New York Times to catch the editors jumping out. But he made some sort of anti-drug proposal during that race, and Milton Friedman sent him a postcard, you know, with sort of a libertarian critique, you know, wars on drugs are futile, and so on. And this was a problem that Bill wrestled with, and he just saw over the years, he came to see that resources were being wasted on this. It was a combination of the futility of it and, at a certain level, the injustice of it, because enforcement has to be so capricious. You know, some people get it in the neck, other people go blithely along, and so that's why he wrote that issue or printed that issue.
Just the other day on your blog, you saluted President Obama for deciding not to prosecute violations of federal laws against pot in those states where medical marijuana is permitted. What appealed to you about that?
I think it was a recognition of the political reality that in 14 states, state laws have been passed to lift the penalties on medical use of marijuana. This is something I had to do myself. I had cancer in 1992, and one thing marijuana can do is relieve the nausea that's often an effect of chemotherapy. So that's a hobby horse of mine. I think it's a very important issue. And voters in 14 states have taken that position. Now, federal law prevails over those state laws, but what President Obama decided was we will not use our resources of law enforcement to prosecute medical users in states where the state laws allow them to do that.
And you wrote, law and order is not served by passing laws that bring the system into contempt.